History isn't done speaking. Subscribe and stay for what it says next. 19.8%. That's not a population estimate. That's not a poll number. That's a fraction of the paternal bloodline of a nation. One man in 5 carrying a genetic signature that has nothing to do with the empire his ancestors are credited with building. Before you know which country this is, understand what it built. Ships that reached India before any other European power got there. Trade routes that stitched together 4 continents. An empire that, at its height, stretched from Brazil to Goa to Macau. A national mythology built on one idea, a single, unbroken, Catholic seafaring people who went out and conquered the world, rather than being shaped by anyone else. Now put the number back next to that story. 1 in 5 men in that population, nearly 20%, carries a paternal lineage that traces not to Rome, not to the Visigoths, not to the Age of Discovery's imagined pure stock, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the national story insists was closed off centuries before the ships ever left port. The country is Portugal, and that reveal is only the surface. There are 2 hidden signatures layered into this genome, not one. This segment will show you the version of history everyone was taught. The next will start pulling it apart. Because what does it mean when the empire that colonized half the globe was, in its own bloodline, hiding the very people it once forced to disappear? Here is the family tree Portuguese identity has been taught to stand on for centuries. It starts, in the national imagination, with the Lusitanians, a pre-Roman tribal confederation whose leader, Viriathus, fought Roman legions to a standstill in the 2nd century BCE before being betrayed and assassinated. Viriathus isn't just a historical footnote, he's a founding myth. Statues of him stand in Portuguese cities today. He's taught as the first man who made Portuguese resistance a distinct thing, separate from the rest of Iberia, centuries before Portugal existed as a country. Rome won in the end, of course. The region became the province of Lusitania, and Latin became the linguistic bedrock of what would eventually become Portuguese. Then Rome fell, and a Germanic people called the Suebi carved out a kingdom in the northwest in the 5th century CE, later swallowed by the Visigoths, who ruled most of Iberia until the 8th century. Then came 1139. Then 1143. Afonso Henriques declared himself king, broke away from the neighboring kingdom of Leon, and Portugal was born. Not as an ethnic claim exactly, but that's how it's often taught. The birth of a distinct Iberian Catholic nation, separate from Spain, with its own destiny. From there, the story runs in one direction. Centuries of the Reconquista, Christian kingdoms pushing south, reclaiming territory from Muslim rule, culminating in 1249, when the fall of the Algarve completed what the textbooks call the reconquest of Portuguese soil. The word matters, reconquest, not integration, not absorption. A clean line. In the popular telling, the old population pushed out, the land returned to its rightful people. Then the story accelerates into glory. Henry the Navigator in the 15th century, funding voyages down the African coast. Vasco da Gama reaching India in 1498. Pedro Alvarez Cabral reaching Brazil in 1500. A tiny nation on the edge of Europe, punching far above its weight, spreading itself across the globe. Notice the shape of it. Notice how deliberately homogeneous it is. This is a story about old Christian stock, untouched, in the telling, by the populations it conquered, converted, or absorbed. Muslim, Jewish, foreign, all treated as chapters that closed, populations that either left or disappeared from the bloodline entirely, leaving a single, continuous Portuguese people who then went out and colonized everyone else. That is the story. That is what generations were taught to believe about their own ancestry. But one figure kept showing up in the Y-chromosome data that this story has no room for at all. Go back to that number from the opening, 19.8%. And this time, look at where it actually came from. In 2008, a research team led by geneticist Susan M. Adams published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics that would quietly upend the tidy version of Iberian history. The team sequenced Y-chromosome lineages, the genetic thread passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, like a name handed down instead of a face, across 1,140 men sampled from the Iberian Peninsula and the Balearic Islands. Think of a haplogroup as a surname written in DNA instead of ink, a marker that travels down one line, largely unchanged, letting researchers trace which population a paternal ancestor most likely belonged to, centuries or millennia back. What they found, an average of roughly 19.8% Sephardic Jewish paternal ancestry, and roughly 10.6% North African ancestry, embedded in the paternal lineages across the peninsula. The researchers themselves called these figures remarkably high for what's supposed to be a Western European population, and it wasn't evenly spread. Some Portuguese sampling sites showed Sephardic-associated lineages at levels matching, in places exceeding, many Spanish regions, which undercuts one specific assumption Portugal's national story leans on especially hard, the idea that its history was somehow cleaner than Spain's, less entangled, more resolved. The markers themselves have names, J1 and J2, haplogroups common in Levantine populations and historically associated with Jewish communities. EM81, sometimes called the Berber marker, tied to Amazigh and Moorish North African populations, like a genetic fingerprint left behind by people the history books insist simply left. Here is where it gets complicated. The reason these numbers sit so high isn't some faint echo of ancient contact or distant trade. It's a specific decision made in a specific year, 1497. Spain, in 1492, expelled its Jewish population outright, forced people out, and their descendants' genes leave with them. Portugal, 5 years later, chose differently. King Manuel I ordered forced conversion instead of expulsion. Don't send the population away, absorb it. Erase the religion, keep the people. Which means the closed chapter segment 2 ended on was never actually closed. It went underground. It went into baptismal records instead of exile ships. It went into families who called themselves Old Christian for 5 centuries while carrying, in their Y-chromosomes, an unbroken paternal line back to the population their own national story insisted had vanished. Clean. Expected. That's how the Reconquista is supposed to read. Not by expulsion, by forced absorption. The Reconquista wasn't a clean religious sorting of population from population. It was a demographic folding in. One people pushed underneath another, told to disappear in name only. And the official story, the one built on Viriathus and Afonso Henriques and Vasco da Gama, simply left that part out. That number explains a lot. But it doesn't explain all of it. There's a second population hiding in this genome, and its story is even harder to erase. So what does mainstream research actually say is happening here? The leading explanation is straightforward on its face. The high Sephardic Y-DNA frequency reflects mass, forced assimilation of Portugal's Jewish population following the 1497 conversion decree. Historians estimate that Portugal's Jewish and newly converted population made up a meaningful minority share of the country at the time, a population that, over more than 500 years, was gradually folded into the general Old Christian gene pool through intermarriage, migration, and simple demographic time. The logic follows directly from the historical divergence between the two Iberian kingdoms. Because Portugal converted its Jewish population rather than expelling it, that population never left the genetic record the way Spain's expelled Jews did. Their descendants stayed, married, had children, and their Y-chromosomes stayed in the national bloodline, which is exactly why Portuguese sampling sites in the Adams study sit at or above Spanish regional averages, despite Portugal's official narrative of being the tidier, more homogeneous of the two nations. This isn't a fringe theory. Historians of the Portuguese Inquisition, formally established in 1536, have documented generations of Cristão Novo, or New Christian, families who lived under sustained surveillance for centuries after their ancestors' forced conversion, watched for any sign of crypto-Jewish practice, a lit candle on a Friday night, a reluctance to eat certain foods, a name changed just slightly too carefully. But, and researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty, Y-chromosome haplogroup sharing is not proof of a single point of origin. The J1 and J2 lineages, used as the Sephardic ancestry marker in this framework, are also present in other Eastern Mediterranean-descended populations who reached Iberia through entirely different routes. Roman-era migration, Phoenician trade colonies established over 2,000 years ago, and other Levantine contact that predates any specifically Jewish community in the region by centuries. Which means that 19.8% figure may be inflated. Some real, unknown share of it may not be Sephardic in the historical sense at all, but older Mediterranean lineages folded into the same genetic signature and read, by modern methods, as one population when they may represent several. The scientists behind these studies are the first to say so themselves. Y-DNA analysis like this can only ever estimate ancestry probabilistically. The modeled error margins are wide enough that Jewish ancestry here is a best fit interpretation of the data, not a settled fact. But the Sephardic story only accounts for one piece of what's showing up on this chromosome. The other lineage points somewhere the history books call over 700 years too early. 700 years too early, because the second lineage doesn't point to 1497 at all. It points to 711. The marker is called EM81, sometimes shorthanded in the research as the Berber marker. Think of it as a genetic postmark, one that tells you not just that a letter arrived, but roughly which coastline it was mailed from. In the Adams study, this lineage showed up at an average of 10.6% across the Iberian Peninsula. But it wasn't evenly distributed. It concentrated, noticeably, in the south, in the Algarve, in exactly the region the consensus story in the earlier telling treated as a chapter that closed in 1249. Except it didn't close in 1249, it opened 538 years earlier, in 711, when Moorish forces crossed from North Africa and began a period of Islamic governance and settlement over southern Iberia that lasted until the final reconquest of the Algarve. 5 centuries. Not an occupation, a settlement. Generations were born, lived, and died under that rule, before anyone's grandchildren saw a reconquest happen at all. And here's the mismatch. The story Beat 2 told was one of military sorting. Crystal clear narration brings each scene vividly to life, engaging your senses. What this marker shows is something slower and stickier. 500 years of North African governance doesn't evaporate at a battle's end. It settles into the population the way sediment settles into a riverbed. You don't see it while the water's moving, but it's there long after, shaping everything downstream. Researchers studying this admixture link, EM81, specifically to Amazigh, Berber, North African populations, not Arab lineages narrowly, which complicates even the popular shorthand of Moorish invaders as a single ethnic bloc. It wasn't one people, it was several, folded into one word by later storytellers. Here is where the story stops being simple. Because the 2 lineages, the one attributed to Sephardic ancestry and this one, are not cleanly separable. J1, the marker leaned on in the Sephardic reading, is also present in Arabian Peninsula populations and in North African Muslim communities of the same medieval period, which means some share of what got labeled Jewish in the earlier reading may actually be Moorish-era Muslim ancestry, and some share of what looks Moorish may carry threads of the same Levantine Jewish diaspora lineages the other theory claims. The 2 theories were never standing in separate rooms. They were reading the same overlapping evidence and calling it 2 different names. So which is it? Jewish, Muslim, both, neither cleanly? The honest answer is that the 2 stories were never separate. And there's a third possibility the mainstream conversation barely touches at all. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud in polished form, moves the clock forward again, into the exact era Portugal is proudest of. By the mid-16th century, Lisbon was not just a departure point for ships bound for India and Brazil. It was also one of early Europe's central hubs for the Atlantic and trans-Saharan slave trade. Enslaved and free black Africans made up a documented, visible share of Lisbon's population during precisely the decades the Age of Discovery narrative was busy writing itself into legend. A demographic reality that simply has no place in the story of caravels and spice routes and Catholic kings. Some genetic surveys of modern Iberian populations have detected low-frequency sub-Saharan associated lineages, certain L haplogroup signals, sitting quietly inside the same paternal data as everything else. But researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. Sample sizes here are small. It's genuinely difficult to separate a 16th century arrival from a 19th century one, or a 20th century one, using Y-DNA alone. This is the least resolved of the 3 threads, an open question, not an established finding, and it deserves to be treated that way rather than dressed up as settled proof. But sit with why this one unsettles people more than the other 2. It doesn't just complicate a religious or military narrative from 5 centuries back. It quietly implicates the Golden Age itself, the ships, the maps, the naval heroes, as also being the machinery of a trafficking system that appears to have left its own trace in the very bloodline of the people running it. Imagine standing in Belmonte, a small town in the mountains of northeastern Portugal, tucked near the Spanish border, its streets steep and built from pale granite. The kind of place that feels a full step removed from the coastal empire it technically belongs to. Isolated, overlooked. And for exactly that reason, it kept a secret longer than almost anywhere else in the country. For more than 400 years after the forced conversions of 1497, a crypto-Jewish community here kept its faith alive. Not in synagogues, which would have been discovered instantly, but inside homes. Prayers recited quietly behind closed doors. Tradition passed down by voice, not by text, because a written prayer book could be seized and used as evidence. And it was women, generation after generation, who carried the ritual knowledge forward. Because domestic life gave them the cover to do it discreetly, where men's public lives, under inquisitorial watch, did not. The world outside Belmonte didn't know any of this had survived. Then, in 1917, a mining engineer named Samuel Schwartz was working in the region and, almost by accident, uncovered the community still practicing, 4 centuries after the conversion decree that was supposed to have erased them entirely. Belmonte matters here because it makes visible, in one town, what the Y-chromosome data has been describing invisibly across an entire country. The statistics in the earlier segment aren't an abstraction. They're the population scale version of exactly what happened, quietly, in that one mountain town. Except everywhere else, no one was left to keep the memory. Only the genome kept it. Now step back out. All the way out. Back to the empire. Back to the ships. Back to where this story began. For centuries, Portugal's colonial and religious authorities enforced limpeza de sangue, purity of blood statutes, alongside relentless inquisitorial scrutiny of new Christian families, monitoring them for any sign their conversion wasn't sincere. And here is the reframe the whole script has been building toward. Those laws weren't a description of a genetically pure population defending itself from outside contamination. They were an anxious reaction to a population the authorities half understood was already blended. A set of rules written specifically because the line they were trying to enforce didn't actually exist in the blood, only in the paperwork. Look back at everything this genome has said. The Reconquista wasn't a clean sorting of populations. It was 30 generations folding into each other. The Sephardic signal wasn't a footnote closed out in 1497. It was a population driven underground, not away. The Moorish era lineage wasn't erased at the fall of the Algarve. It had already been settling into the population for 500 years. And the possible African lineage doesn't sit outside the age of discovery. It may sit inside the very ships and ports that made that age possible. Put together, the reveal is larger than any one of its parts. The empire that built its identity on old Christian purity, that used that idea to persecute, monitor, and exile, and that later profited from trafficking human beings across an ocean, carried, in its own paternal lineage, substantial ancestry from precisely the populations it had defined itself against. Not as an accusation, as a structural irony written into the data itself. Old Christian Portuguese purity was never a genetic fact. It was a category built out of law, fear, and enforcement. And the one dataset that was never going to lie about it was sitting quietly in the Y-chromosome the whole time. Closed. Never was. And this pattern doesn't belong to Portugal alone. Every population that has ever built its identity around the idea of purity, religious purity, ethnic purity, national purity, turns out, at the genetic level, to be a record of exactly the mixing that identity was constructed to deny. Researchers have found this same shape again and again in supposedly homogeneous populations across Europe, across Asia, wherever anyone has actually gone looking with the tools to check. There is no tidy answer here. The Sephardic thread, the Moorish thread, the African thread, none of them cancels the others out, and none of them resolves into a single clean story of who the Portuguese really are. They sit layered on top of each other, the way sediment sits in a riverbed, each era leaving its trace on top of the one before it, none of them washed away by the ones that came after. The Portuguese were never who their own history books said they were, and the DNA was never going to let them forget it.